Offering shelter to a stranger during a storm leads to profound discoveries. As conversations deepen, the millionaire uncovers truths about his origins that redefine his identity. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The rain pounded against the windows of Ethan Parker's mansion with increasing intensity. Standing in his study, surrounded by dark mahogany furniture and expensive art pieces, Ethan watched lightning illuminate the night sky. His reflection in the window showed a man in his early 40s, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Despite his success, the emptiness of the house seemed to mock him. The mansion, situated on the outskirts of a small Midwest town, stood as a testament to his business acumen. Ethan had built his fortune through strategic investments and ruthless determination. But tonight, none of that seemed to matter. The quarterly reports scattered across his desk couldn't fill the void that grew larger with each passing year. A sudden crash from outside broke through his thoughts. At first, he dismissed it as thunder, but then he heard it again, distinctly different from the storm's natural sounds. Ethan moved to his security system panel, checking the cameras. Through the grainy footage, he spotted movement near the garden entrance. Common sense told him to call security. Instead, grabbing an umbrella, he walked to the rear door. The security lights illuminated a figure huddled against the garden wall. A woman, drenched to the bone, her clothes clinging to her frame as she shivered uncontrollably. "Are you all right?" Ethan called out, keeping his distance. The woman looked up, revealing a face marked by exhaustion, but carrying a dignity that caught him off guard. She appeared to be in her 60s, with gray streaks in her dark hair and deep brown eyes that held both strength and vulnerability. "I'm sorry," she managed through chattering teeth. "My car broke down about a mile back. I saw the lights and thought." She trailed off, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. Ethan hesitated. In his position, paranoia wasn't just prudent, it was necessary. How many times had his lawyers warned him about potential scams and setups? Yet something in the woman's demeanor struck him as genuine. "Come inside," he found himself saying, surprising even himself. "You'll catch pneumonia out here." The woman, who introduced herself as Mariah Johnson, followed him into the house. Water dripped from her clothes onto the marble floor, creating small puddles that would have normally irritated him. Tonight, he couldn't bring himself to care. He led her to the main sitting room, where a gas fireplace provided immediate warmth. The room, with its plush leather furniture and crystal decanters, seemed to overwhelm Mariah, who perched uncertainly on the edge of an armchair. "I'll get you something dry to wear," Ethan said, noticing how she tried to minimize her contact with the expensive furniture. "And maybe some hot tea?" "Tea would be wonderful, thank you," Mariah replied, her voice carrying a hint of an accent he couldn't quite place. Southern maybe, but refined by years of careful modification. When Ethan returned with clothes and tea, he found Mariah staring at the family photos on the mantel, or rather, the lack thereof. The only images displayed were of business achievements and newspaper clippings about his success. The tension between them was palpable as she accepted the clothes and tea. Here they were, two strangers thrown together by circumstance, each clearly carrying their own burdens. The storm outside intensified, as if nature itself was conspiring to keep them in each other's company. "I really appreciate your kindness," Mariah said, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Not many people would take in a stranger these days." Ethan nodded, settling into the chair across from her. "What brings you out on a night like this?" he asked, curiosity getting the better of him. The question hung in the air, accompanied by another crack of thunder. Mariah's expression shifted, suggesting that the answer to his simple question was anything but straightforward. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and somehow, Ethan knew this chance encounter would prove more significant than either of them could imagine. The warmth of the fireplace gradually eased the chill from Mariah's bones as she began to share her story. Now dressed in borrowed clothes that were too large for her frame, she spoke with a measured tone that suggested years of careful consideration about how to present her past. "I grew up in Oakwood Heights," she said, naming one of the poorest neighborhoods in the state. Back in the 60s, it wasn't just about being poor. It was about being invisible. People looked right through you if your skin was dark and your clothes were worn. Ethan shifted in his chair, unconsciously adjusting his expensive watch. His own world of board meetings and million-dollar deals seemed far removed from the reality Mariah described. "My mother worked 3 jobs," Mariah continued, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "She cleaned houses during the day, worked at a diner in the evening, and took in laundry at night. But no matter how hard she worked, some people only saw what they wanted to see." The rain continued its steady rhythm against the windows as Mariah described incidents that made Ethan's stomach turn. Being forced to use separate entrances, watching her mother smile politely at people who treated her with contempt, fighting twice as hard for half the recognition in school. "But you know what's strange?" she said, finally meeting his gaze. "Those experiences shaped me, made me stronger, though I wouldn't wish them on anyone else." Something in her words struck a chord with Ethan. Setting down his own untouched tea, he found himself speaking about things he rarely discussed. "I built all this," he gestured to the mansion around them, "thinking it would make me feel complete. Each success was supposed to fill some void, prove something to someone. But sitting in board meetings, surrounded by yes men who laugh at my jokes because they're afraid not to, it's its own kind of invisibility." Mariah nodded, understanding flickering across her features. "Different cage, same bars?" "Exactly," Ethan agreed, surprised by how easily the admission came. "I have people who manage my schedule, my diet, my public image. But when's the last time someone asked me how I really feel about any of it?" Their conversation deepened, touching on subjects that went beyond surface-level pleasantries. They discussed how society's expectations had shaped their choices. Mariah's struggle to be seen as capable and worthy, Ethan's pressure to maintain an image of unwavering success. "Sometimes," Mariah said, adjusting the oversized sweater, "I think about how race and identity become these boxes we're supposed to fit into. But people are so much more complex than that." Ethan found himself nodding. "In business, I'm often the only one in the room who came from nothing. They don't know about the nights I spent studying while working as a janitor, or how I saved every penny until I could make my first investment. And yet," Mariah observed, "here we are having this conversation. Would you have believed this morning that you'd be discussing life's big questions with a stranger who showed up at your door?" The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The storm that had forced them together had created a space where social barriers seemed less rigid, where honest conversation felt not just possible, but necessary. "It's funny," Ethan mused, "how we spend so much time building walls around ourselves, only to discover that the most meaningful connections happen when we let them down." Mariah's response was interrupted by another crash of thunder. But the initial tension between them had transformed into something different, a shared understanding that transcended their apparent differences. As their discussion continued, neither could shake the feeling that this chance encounter was more than just a coincidence. The storm outside might have brought them together, but something deeper was keeping them engaged in this unexpected dialogue about life, identity, and the masks people wear to survive in their respective worlds. The storm reached its crescendo outside, the wind howling through the trees as Ethan and Mariah's conversation ventured into more personal territory. The grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, but neither seemed to notice the passing time. "I lost my mother figure, Sarah, 5 years ago," Mariah said, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the room. "She wasn't my biological mother, but she took me in when I needed guidance the most. Taught me how to navigate a world that wasn't always kind." Ethan's hand tightened around his armrest. The mention of mothers touched a raw nerve he usually kept well hidden. "I was told my mother died when I was an infant," he said, the words coming out more stiffly than he intended. "My father rarely spoke about her, and when he did, it was always vague. Just that she was gone, and that was that." Mariah's expression changed subtly, a flicker of something, pain, recognition, crossing her features before she composed herself. "That must have been difficult, growing up without her." "I built this narrative in my head about who she was," Ethan admitted, surprising himself with his candor. "Sometimes I imagined she was an angel who died tragically. Other times, I convinced myself she must have had a good reason for leaving, if she did leave. The uncertainty was often worse than knowing the truth. Lightning illuminated the room, casting sharp shadows across their faces. Mariah leaned forward slightly, her eyes studying Ethan with an intensity that made him both uncomfortable and curious. "Have you ever tried to find out more about her?" she asked carefully, her voice barely audible above the storm. "My father destroyed all photos of her before he died. Said it was too painful to keep them." Ethan stood up, walking to the window. "The few times I tried investigating on my own, I hit dead ends. It's like she existed in a vacuum. No records, no family history, nothing." Mariah's hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup. "Sometimes people have reasons for disappearing," she said quietly. "Reasons that might seem impossible to understand from the outside." There was something in her tone that made Ethan turn from the window to look at her more closely. The elegant older woman sitting in his living room suddenly seemed to carry the weight of countless untold stories. "You speak like someone who knows about disappearing," he observed. Mariah met his gaze steadily. "We all have chapters of our lives we keep closed, Mr. Parker. Sometimes for our protection, sometimes for others." The use of his surname struck him as odd, considering the intimate nature of their conversation. But before he could comment, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, making them both jump. "The storm's getting worse," Mariah noted, but Ethan barely heard her. His mind was racing, trying to piece together something he couldn't quite grasp. There was a familiarity about Mariah that he couldn't shake, something in her gestures, the way she held herself, even the particular shade of brown in her eyes. "Tell me more about Sarah," he found himself asking. "The woman who took you in." Mariah's response was measured, as if she was choosing each word with extreme care. "She taught me that sometimes the hardest choices are made out of love, that sometimes we have to let go of what we want most to protect it." The cryptic nature of her response only intensified Ethan's growing sense that there was more to this encounter than chance. The storm that had brought this stranger to his door was starting to feel less like a coincidence and more like fate. The shrill ring of Ethan's phone cut through their conversation like a knife. The caller ID displayed Harrison and Associates, and Ethan's posture immediately stiffened. Excusing himself, he answered the call, his voice shifting into what Mariah recognized as his business tone. "Parker speaking," he said, walking a few steps away. But in the quiet room, his conversation remained audible. "The board is concerned about the recent media speculation, Mr. Parker," a clipped voice announced through the speaker. "Your bachelor status and isolated lifestyle are generating unwanted attention. The shareholders expect a certain image." Ethan's jaw clenched. "My personal life has no bearing on the company's performance." "On the contrary," the voice continued, "your image is intrinsically linked to the company's value. We suggest arranging some public appearances, perhaps with Caroline Maxwell. Her family's connections would be beneficial." After ending the call, Ethan stood silent for a moment, his back to Mariah. When he turned, the vulnerable man from their earlier conversation had been replaced by someone carrying the weight of expectations on his shoulders. "They want to arrange my personal life like it's another business merger," he said, bitterness seeping into his voice. "Everything has to fit their perfect narrative. The successful businessman, the right connections, the appropriate social circle." Mariah watched him pace the room. "And what do you want, Ethan?" The question stopped him in his tracks. "What I want?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've spent so long being what everyone else wants that I'm not sure I know anymore." "The pressure to maintain appearances," Mariah observed. "It's another form of invisibility, isn't it? Hiding who you really are behind what others expect you to be." Ethan collapsed back into his chair. "Every decision I make affects thousands of employees, millions in investments. The board talks about image, but what they really mean is control. They want to own every aspect of my life. And you let them?" Mariah's question held no judgment, only curiosity. "I built this company from nothing," Ethan replied, running a hand through his hair. "It's my life's work. But sometimes," he trailed off, looking around at his opulent surroundings, "sometimes I wonder if I'm just as trapped as I was when I was poor." Mariah leaned forward, her expression intent. Success without authenticity is just another prison. Your worth isn't measured by their expectations, Ethan. Her words struck something deep within him. There's this constant pressure to be perfect, to never show weakness. One wrong move, and everything I've built could crumble. Perhaps, Mariah suggested gently, what needs to crumble are the walls you've built around yourself, not your success. The statement hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Ethan found himself questioning everything. His choices, his isolation, the carefully constructed facade he presented to the world. How do you do it? He asked finally. How do you stay true to yourself when the world demands you be someone else? By remembering that at the end of your life, you won't regret the business deals you missed or the parties you didn't attend, Mariah answered. You'll regret the connections you didn't make, the truth you didn't speak, the love you didn't allow yourself to feel. Her words resonated with a part of Ethan he'd long suppressed. The part that yearned for genuine connection, for understanding, for truth beyond the polished surface he presented to the world. The grandfather clock struck 9, reminding them both that neither had eaten. Ethan, breaking from his usual routine of carefully planned meals, suggested they move to the kitchen for an impromptu dinner. I'm afraid my cooking skills are limited, he admitted, surveying the well-equipped but rarely used kitchen. Usually my chef handles all this. Mariah stood from her chair, a small smile playing at her lips. Then let me help. It's the least I can do for your hospitality. Together, they managed to assemble a simple meal from the contents of his refrigerator. The domestic activity felt foreign to Ethan, who couldn't remember the last time he'd prepared food with someone else. You know, Mariah said as she diced vegetables with practiced ease, cooking was one of the few things that connected me to my past. When everything else changes, recipes stay the same. Ethan watched her movements, noting how comfortable she seemed in the kitchen. I never learned. My father believed cooking was beneath us, even when we could barely afford takeout. And your mother? Mariah asked carefully, her knife pausing mid-chop. Did your father ever mention if she cooked? The question caught Ethan off guard. Once, he said slowly, memory surfacing. He mentioned something about cornbread, said she made it better than anyone he knew. It's one of the only specific things he ever told me about her. Mariah's hand trembled slightly, but she quickly resumed chopping. Have you ever wondered about your mother's family? Your heritage? Of course, Ethan replied, setting plates on the counter. But my father was adamant about cutting ties with that part of my past. Said it was better to focus on the future. As they sat down to eat, Mariah studied his face intently. Sometimes our origins shape us more than we realize, even when we don't know them. The simple meal they prepared triggered something in Ethan, memories of questions he'd suppressed for years. It's strange, he mused. I've hired private investigators to research business competitors, but I've never seriously investigated my own background. Perhaps you weren't ready, Mariah suggested. Some truths require the right moment to be revealed. Ethan set down his fork, struck by her words. Why do I get the feeling you know more than you're saying? Mariah met his gaze steadily. Everyone has their own journey to truth, Ethan. Sometimes the hardest part is knowing when to start looking. The conversation shifted as they ate, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was unfolding. Each of Mariah's careful questions seemed to lead somewhere, though he couldn't yet see the destination. If you could find out everything about your mother right now, Mariah asked, would you want to know? The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Ethan felt his heart rate increase slightly. Even if it changed everything I thought I knew about myself. Especially then, Mariah replied softly. As the storm outside began to show signs of weakening, the atmosphere inside the mansion had transformed completely. The initial awkwardness between Ethan and Mariah had given way to something deeper, more meaningful. You know, Ethan said, helping Mariah clear the dishes despite her protests. I can't remember the last time I had a conversation this honest with anyone. Most people either want something from me or are too intimidated to speak freely. Mariah dried her hands on a kitchen towel, her expression thoughtful. Sometimes the most profound connections come when we least expect them. A chance encounter in a storm, She paused, looking at him with an intensity that made him both uncomfortable and intrigued. They moved back to the living room, where the fire had died down to a gentle glow. The rain had softened to a steady patter, no longer threatening but persistent. "What are your dreams, Ethan?" Mariah asked suddenly. "Not your business goals or investment plans. Your real dreams?" The question caught him off guard. He started, then stopped. "Nobody's asked me that in years." "That's not an answer," she pressed gently. Ethan sat quietly for a moment, genuinely considering the question. "I always want Ed to make a difference," he finally admitted. "Not just accumulating wealth, but actually changing lives. When I was poor, I promised myself I'd never forget what it felt like to need help and not get it." Mariah's eyes softened. "And have you kept that promise?" "I donate to charities," he said defensively, then sighed. "But no, not really. I've been so focused on building my empire that I forgot why I wanted success in the first place." "It's never too late to realign with your true purpose," Mariah said. Her next words seemed carefully chosen. "I've spent my life trying to make a difference in small ways, helping people who society overlooks." "Like what you do?" Ethan asked, realizing he still didn't know her profession. "I work with troubled youth," she replied. "Kids who need someone to believe in them, to show them a different path." She hesitated before adding, "Sometimes the smallest actions can change the course of someone's entire life." Something in her tone made Ethan lean forward. "You speak from experience?" "More than you know," she murmured, almost to herself. Then, more clearly, "I've seen how a single decision, made with love but carrying deep pain, can echo through decades." Ethan felt drawn to her words, sensing deeper meaning, but unable to grasp it fully. "I want to do something meaningful," he declared suddenly. "Something that matters beyond quarterly reports and stock prices." "Then do it," Mariah challenged. "You have the resources, the influence. What's stopping you?" "Fear," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "Fear of disappointing expectations, of stepping out of the role I've created for myself." Mariah stood and walked to the window, her silhouette outlined against the dark glass. Sometimes the greatest act of courage is being true to yourself, regardless of the consequences. "I promise," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Whatever happens after tonight, I'm going to make changes. Real ones." Mariah turned back to him, her eyes glistening with what might have been tears. "Some promises have the power to heal more than just our own wounds, Ethan. Remember that." The first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, the storm clouds finally breaking apart. Ethan stood at his window, watching the transformation from night to day, his mind racing with new possibilities and unanswered questions. "I need to know," he said suddenly, turning to Mariah. "I need to know about my mother, about where I came from. All these years, I've been running from my past, pretending it didn't matter." Mariah's expression was a mixture of anticipation and concern. "Are you sure? Once you start down this path..." "I'm sure," he interrupted. "I know the perfect place to start, the old neighborhood where my father said she grew up. It's not far from here." A flash of something, recognition, fear, crossed Mariah's face. She hesitated before speaking, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I could go with you if you'd like." Ethan studied her carefully. "You seem nervous about that idea." "Let's just say I have my own past to confront in that neighborhood," she replied carefully. "Sometimes our journeys align in ways we don't expect." Making a quick decision, Ethan grabbed his car keys from the desk. The storm had passed, leaving the roads wet but passable. "We can take my car," he offered. "It's better equipped for the conditions." As they prepared to leave, Ethan noticed Mariah's hands trembling slightly as she gathered her now-dry original clothes. "We don't have to do this now," he said gently. "No," she replied firmly. "Now is exactly when this needs to happen." She paused, adding softly, "Some truths have waited long enough." They got into Ethan's luxury SUV, the leather seats still cool from the night air. As they pulled out of the long driveway, Mariah gave directions with a familiarity that might have seemed strange if Ethan wasn't so focused on his own churning emotions. "What do you hope to?" "Fine," Mariah asked as they drove through the awakening city. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tighter. Answers. Truth. Maybe some understanding of why my father was so determined to erase that part of my history. And if the truth is difficult? Mariah pressed. If it changes everything you thought you knew about yourself, then I'll deal with it, he responded, more confidently than he felt. I'm tired of living with questions that have haunted me my entire life. As they drove, the neighborhoods changed gradually from affluent suburbs to more modest areas. Mariah grew quieter, her eyes fixed on the passing scenes with an intensity that suggested she was seeing more than just buildings and streets. Turn left at the next corner, she instructed, her voice barely above a whisper. The old community center should still be there. Ethan followed her directions, wondering how she knew this area so well. Each turn seemed to take them deeper into a past that was both foreign and strangely familiar to him. The SUV rolled slowly through streets that seemed frozen in time. Despite obvious signs of poverty, there was a vibrant energy to the neighborhood. Children playing on front stoops, elderly residents tending small gardens, and the sounds of gospel music drifting from an old church. Oakwood Heights, Mariah announced softly. It hasn't changed as much as you might think. Ethan parked in front of a weathered community center, its brick facade showing years of wear, but also signs of loving maintenance. As they stepped out of the car, his expensive shoes seemed out of place on the cracked sidewalk. Several people stopped to stare, but their expressions changed noticeably when they saw Mariah. An elderly woman sweeping her porch suddenly dropped her broom. "Sweet Jesus," the woman exclaimed. "Mariah Johnson? Is that really you?" "Miss Rose," Mariah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "You haven't aged a day." Miss Rose hurried down her steps, embracing Mariah tightly. "Child, we thought you'd never come back." Her eyes darted to Ethan, then back to Mariah, a question in them that went unspoken. Ethan stood awkwardly to the side, feeling like an intruder in this reunion. He noticed how people began gathering, word spreading quickly through the neighborhood about Mariah's return. Each person who approached seemed to carry pieces of a story he couldn't quite grasp. "You remember my boy Marcus?" A middle-aged man asked Mariah, gesturing to a young doctor in scrubs. "The scholarship program you started before you left, it put him through medical school." Mariah hugged the young doctor, pride evident in her expression. "You did the work, Marcus. I just opened a door." More people gathered, each with their own story of how Mariah had touched their lives. Ethan observed it all, feeling increasingly disconnected from his usual world of boardrooms and business deals. Here was impact that couldn't be measured in dollars or stock prices. An older man approached last, walking with a cane, but carrying himself with dignity. "Sister," he said to Mariah, his voice heavy with meaning. "It's time, isn't it?" Mariah nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes, James. It's time." The man turned to Ethan, studying him intensely. "You look just like your grandmother," he said finally. Same determined chin, same way of standing. Ethan felt his world tilt slightly. "You knew my grandmother?" "Knew her?" James smiled sadly. "Boy, I was there the day your mother had to make the hardest decision of her life." The atmosphere grew thick with tension. Mariah stepped forward, placing a hand on James's arm. "Maybe we should go inside," she suggested. "There's a lot to discuss." They followed James into the community center, where old photographs lined the walls. Ethan's attention was caught by one in particular, a younger Mariah standing proudly in front of the same building, surrounded by children. The date on the photo made his heart skip a beat. Inside the community center, James led them to a small office filled with filing cabinets and old records. The room smelled of paper and time, decades of community history stored within its walls. "I've kept everything," James said, pulling out a worn manila envelope. "Every letter, every photo, every document. I knew someday they'd be needed." Mariah sat heavily in a chair, her composure beginning to crack. Her hands shook as James handed her the envelope. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely steady, "there's something you need to see." From the envelope, she withdrew a faded photograph. It showed a much younger Mariah, beautiful and proud, holding a baby. The resemblance between the infant and Ethan's own baby pictures was unmistakable. "That was taken the day before I had to give you up," Mariah whispered. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of a desk to steady himself. "What are you saying?" Mariah's eyes filled with tears. "Your father. He didn't tell you everything. He was a young executive then, and I was working as a cleaner in his office building. We fell in love, but his family—" She paused, collecting herself. "They threatened to destroy both our lives if we stayed together. They said they'd ensure neither of us ever worked again." James stepped forward. They offered her a choice: give you up, let you be raised with privileges and opportunities, or keep you and watch you grow up in poverty, facing the same discrimination she had. Ethan's world spun. The photograph trembled in his hands as he stared at it, seeing his own features reflected in the baby's face. "All these years," he managed. "All these years, my mother was alive. I never stopped thinking about you," Mariah said, her voice breaking. "I watched from afar as you grew up, succeeded, became the man you are. I saw your graduation picture in the paper, your business achievements, every milestone. The stories about your mother's death," James added gently, "were your father's way of keeping the truth hidden. His family's reputation meant everything to them." Ethan slumped into a chair, the weight of revelation crushing him. "Tonight, the storm. You knew who I was when you came to my door." Mariah nodded slowly. "I've been trying to find the courage to tell you for years. When my car broke down near your house tonight, it felt like fate was finally forcing my hand." Another photo slipped from the envelope. Mariah standing outside Ethan's office building years ago, watching from a distance as he walked to his car. The dates continued, showing her presence at key moments in his life. Always in the background, always watching, always loving from afar. The morning sun finally broke through the last remnants of storm clouds, streaming through the community center's windows. Ethan sat in silence, decades of missing pieces finally falling into place. "All those private schools, the best education money could buy," he said, his voice hoarse. "I thought it was my father's ambition, but it was your sacrifice." Mariah wiped tears from her eyes. "Every decision was made with love, Ethan. The hardest kind of love. The kind that puts your child's future ahead of your own happiness. The foundation you started here," Ethan gestured to the community center, the scholarship program, helping troubled youth. "You were trying to give others what you couldn't give me." "I couldn't be your mother," Mariah admitted, "but I could honor what being your mother meant by helping others. Every child I helped, I saw you in their faces." James quietly placed more documents on the desk: birth certificates, letters, photographs that told the complete story of a mother's love and sacrifice. "Your father's family had powerful connections," he explained. "They made sure all official records were sealed or altered." Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the small office. "My entire life has been built on a lie. Everything I thought I knew about myself, my family—" "No," Mariah interrupted firmly. "Your life was built on love, a love so strong, I was willing to break my own heart to give you a better future. Your achievements, your character, the man you've become, that's all real." The morning light caught the tears on Mariah's face as she continued. "I never expected forgiveness, Ethan. I just needed you to know the truth, to understand that you were never abandoned or unwanted. You were loved, so deeply loved that I gave up the right to show you that love." Ethan stopped pacing, looking at Mariah, really looking at her. He saw his own eyes, his own determined expression, his own resilience reflected back at him. Without warning, he crossed the room and pulled her into an embrace. "We've lost so much time," he whispered. "But we have now," Mariah replied, holding him tightly. "If you want it." Pulling back slightly, Ethan smiled through his tears. "The storm that brought you to my door, maybe it was washing away the past, so we could build something new." James quietly excused himself, leaving mother and son alone with their newfound truth. Through the windows, they could see the neighborhood coming alive with morning activity, a community that had protected their secret and kept their story safe until the right moment. "What happens now?" Mariah asked softly. Ethan took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Now we build a future that honors both parts of who I am, Your sacrifice gave me opportunities. It's time I used them to make a real difference." As they walked out of the community center together, the sun had fully risen, transforming puddles from last night's storm into mirrors reflecting the bright morning sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind not destruction, but possibility, a chance for healing, for truth, for a love that had waited decades to be acknowledged. Mother and son stepped into the sunlight together, ready to begin their new chapter, knowing that sometimes the most powerful storms aren't the ones that rage outside, but the ones that transform us from within.